Hi, I'm Doris Purchase, and welcome to Beyond the Frame, a podcast created just for you by Propeller Art Gallery, artists empowering artists in Toronto. Together, we'll take a deep dive into the hearts and minds of working visual artists today and their practice. In each episode, you will hear illuminating and intimate explorations of all things art, and you'll hear it in the artist's own voice. We'll talk process, inspiration, challenges, and much more. Everything you've ever wanted to know about art making or about the artists themselves happens right here. So let's sit back and have a listen, shall we? Today we welcome Michelle Letarte. Which ism is it? Under which ism would you classify your work?
I think my work probably fits best under abstract expressionism, as I paint quite freely, trying to express emotions and trying to render inspiring images in my own way. My drawing skills are very limited, and I am not a professionally trained artist, so any semi-realistic images that I come up with are somewhat closer to naive art, but most of my work is fairly abstract.
Who's your muse? Influencers, educators, mentors? Who has greatly inspired you?
I must say that 30 years ago, I asked my partner, William Fox, who is a talented painter and a fantastic drawer, draws perfectly well, and a graphic artist. And I asked him to paint because he had a lot of time on his hands. So he answered me, "I will only paint if you do." So I said, okay, and this is how I started painting. And we started up north, moving in a canoe between islands in the 30,000 island area north of Manitoulin, settling on an island for a few hours, inspired by the incredible landscape. And in fact, when you are there, you actually see a group of 7 paintings everywhere. So it's totally inspiring. I did study at OCAD on a part-time basis for many years, mostly ceramics and sculpture and textiles, but never in painting or fine arts. But I have taken many workshops with artists in Ontario and in France and in Mexico, and they taught me some very practical aspects of painting and encouraged me to express my creativity and boldness. In Toronto, Didi Kajansky has probably been the most influential mentor, and I have taken many, many workshops with her. Also, some contemporary Quebec artists. There are some that I really look up to, and I would name Jean-Pierre Lafrance and Sylvain Tremblay. I am a Quebecoise, and I really relate to their work as if we were sharing some invisible, distant genetic links and earthy feelings.
Materials matter. What are your chosen favorite tools and preferred medium?
I am by training a scientist, and I directed a research lab in molecular biology and immunology for 38 years. Therefore, my thinking is always project-based and very experimental. I like working with different media and textures. I paint mostly in acrylic, but also work with pastels and pigments. I thrive in using textures such as sand, and I have done many artworks sitting in the Sahara Desert or on the cliffs of Magdalen Island, mixing the local sand with acrylics and working on papier d'ache mostly. Rubbing freshly painted acrylic and pastel layer with sand, or dipping the work in the ocean to get the salt effect is some of my favorite experimental ideas. The more experimental for me, the better, and working outside is my great favorite. But while in the studio, I often use pumice as a texture for the first layer on board or canvas prior to applying the acrylic paint. I also love building collage with various papers, textile, and small found objects. I have taken several workshops, including some in indigo, on the use of indigo and coccinella, on textile, and I've integrated those in paintings and in shows. I also thrive in generating rust imprints from rusty found objects on fabric and on artisanal papers. The majority of my work is inspired from photographs taken during my travels around the world. Because of my work as a scientist, I have the pleasure of traveling to many continents, and particularly Africa, which I cherish a great deal, and I'm still organizing immunology courses on that continent. So this brings me to places like Ethiopia or Benin or Morocco, and it has been fantastic. So each of my show is therefore inspired as a different theme, and I have a great affinity for old walls, as if they carried hidden stories. Caves, rock formation, petroglyphs also speak to me. Finding drawings made thousands of years ago is an amazing thrill, connecting you to distant ancestors and artists. Recently, I have altered my own photos digitally and transferred them to board or canvas and finished them with acrylic paints and gloss medium.
Slump Secrets. What methods do you employ to get yourself out of a slump?
First, I must say that I rarely get into slump because I have a very optimistic personality, A+, of course. But between projects, there is sometimes a dry period. Just to get going, I often take an old painting and start painting it over, just to warm up and get the flow going. Kind of a practice painting that gets thicker and thicker but doesn't go anywhere. As mentioned earlier, I work on set projects, so looking at travel photographs, selecting a subset, printing them, and then transferring them to board or starting a few small paintings inspired by these images is what gets me going.
In the beginning. So tell me a bit about your process. Do you have a bag of tricks, lucky talismans, or habits? Where do you start? And more importantly, when do you stop?
If painting outside, I start by walking around, finding colorful or unusual scenes, old walls, odd shapes, crazy rocks. I collect a few small objects and any rusted metal that I can find. I take several photos for eventual work in the studio. In the early days up north, I collected big lumps of charcoal from fire pits that people left behind and did imprints of rocks on paper first and then on large raw canvases. These canvases were then painted with acrylic using spray bottle with different colors, and once dry, rolled for transport in the canoe back to the lodge. In the studio, I print my selected photos as source of inspiration. I often start by applying, if I'm doing a painting, by applying textures such as pumice or sand mixed with media and applying it with spatula to build what I call the underpainting. For example, the main shapes recognized in an old wall. And it is not small spatula, it is very large spatula that you find in the hardware store rather than the art store. And I use some of them to build the texture using different objects that can work on those textures. I then let this texture layer dry completely, sometimes a few days, and then I add acrylic paint from a pre-selected and tested palette to obtain the tones that I want. And many layers are usually applied in a final coat of gloss media. If my intention is to use photo transfer, I first play on my computer with contrast, inversions of colors, change of palette, filter effects until I obtain images that are more vivid and more challenging to me. I then print these images on paper, often on a regular printer, 8x11 sheet of paper, but also in a much larger format for highly selected images. I use gel medium to transfer the ink layer of the photos to the board, preferably Board is preferable to canvas because of the rigid surface. I let sit for 24 hours so that the transfer occurs completely. And then I spray the back of the paper with water and rub gently the paper layers away from the ink layer, being careful not to damage that ink layer. The process of peeling is tedious and must be repeated several times. Then acrylic paint is used to repair any damaged area using a dry brush or to amplify certain portions of the composition. The photo transfer becomes integrated into a painting. If the transfer is not very successful, the painting becomes much more abstract and sometimes only indirectly related to the primary image. When to stop is always a challenge, and you basically have to follow your gut instinct. Or you show it to a friend, an artist friend, who tells you you have gone too far or don't go any further.
Calling all emo. What do you wish people to think or feel when they contemplate your work?
I want people to feel and live the moments that I am attempting to depict. I want them to share my travel to exotic destinations and the emotions I felt. I also wish to awaken their memories of similar experiences if they have already traveled to those locations. And I want this to be a happy journey. My paintings are very cheerful and not depressing at all. I would like my audience to look, after they have seen some of my paintings, to begin to look at nature, rocks, old walls, caves, with an artistic eye that awakens their imagination, to go deeper into the image, to reveal hidden secrets and view inner depths and underlayers as if they were looking down a microscope.
The struggle is real. Talk to me about your biggest challenges as an artist. What methods do you use to overcome these challenges?
As I mentioned to you, I consider, and I am, primarily a scientist and a researcher, and therefore I have a very different perspective on artistic struggle. I love planning a body of work for a show based on a series of related photos and experiences. My biggest challenges are actually technical in trying to render the images that I see in my head or on the picture. I don't sketch, and I tend to work fast, and so I don't always get the proportions right. Another challenge is getting good value, and that is probably the most difficult in painting. I try to relax when I paint and let the narrative take over and guide the evolving work, so it's very often different from the original inspiring image. Listening to music does help greatly. And I always work on at least 2 paintings and even more at the same time, and you can be sure that one will turn out very well, while the others may not. Also, stopping and putting the work aside till the next day or until later helps in getting a fresh view, or again, asking an artist friend for input.
Picture perfect. In your opinion, what constitutes a perfect piece of art? And what qualities in your own work would you signify as a perfect work? For example, perfect composition, confident brushstrokes illustrating a concept, or something else altogether.
When I succeed in expressing the emotion that I felt when I first saw the image that I'm trying to depict, such as the old wall, or the cave, or the rock face, or the petroglyph, when I can reproduce the feeling of a location, including the heat of the moment, and when I can share that with the viewer, is when I know that my painting has been successful. And when I consider that the composition and the values are good, is a good point for me as well.
Art Speak. How do you feel about titling, discussing, and explaining your work?
I simply adore naming paintings and telling the stories behind the artworks, taking people on a journey and explaining the process. Being a professor teaches you how to share knowledge and expertise and how to get your message across. So Art Speak is a favorite part of my artistic production.
Heavy metal or classical? What do you listen to while you work? Or is silence your thing?
Sometimes silence, but mostly classical music. I am not a heavy metal fan. Choral works, from medieval to very contemporary music, is what I listen to when I'm painting. And it all depends on my mood and on the season. If it's Christmas, I can play Christmas music over and over and love it. And sometimes opera as well. From radio program, but also from CDs.
Why for art, though? Why do you make art?
It has become a physical and emotional outlet over the years, and even a necessity. Painting is fully absorbing for the mind, somewhat like a meditative process, but that involves all your senses. I sometimes experience a guttural feeling, as if my insides were transferred to the canvas in gestural strokes and full colors. Creating artworks is always an enriching and learning exercise, and I simply love the experimental aspects of the artistic process.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Frame, a PAG podcast. To hear more episodes and to view the artist's works, please visit www.propellerartgallery.ca. Hosted by Doris Purchase, produced by Tracy Thomson, and recorded at the Orange Lounge Studio in Toronto. Also, the Propeller Art Gallery recognizes the presence of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Huron-Wendat nations. We acknowledge we are hosted on land governed by Treaty 13, the Toronto Purchase, the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, and the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We are committed to peaceably sharing and caring for the resources around the Great Lakes and operating the gallery on the principles of inclusiveness as we continue to exhibit art created by artists from all over the world. Thank you for listening.